Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
I remember when I was first told, or when I was walked into the office, ready to get my test results, and I did have my husband with me, and I was expecting it to be good news. Oh, it's just this kind of benign lump. The biopsy's come back and it's all kind of... I'd convinced myself that it was going to be fine, so I hadn't actually prepared myself for anything other than, it's a benign lump. And bless the soul, the doctor, not the actual surgeon who ended up operating on me, but the doctor who needed to tell me my results. She just said, "So you've got cancer." That was the first words out of her mouth. And I just went blank. I couldn't. It was like the air conditioning became really loud and it was all just buzzing and I couldn't understand. And she'd gone into communication mode of, so the position where it is, this is what we need to do. You need to get your MRI. You need to do this so we can determine, the size, the spread, the blah, blah, blah. And she was systematically going through what she needed to communicate to me, ticking off the boxes and sort of saying, well, the earliest we can get you into surgery, given the process we have to go through, is 6 weeks from now. That would be this date. Are you free this date? And I was still back at, what do you mean I have cancer? But she had just moved on into, fixing stuff. And I was still at the, no, I don't have cancer. And my husband just grabbed my hand and he was taking all the notes. And he was texting my sons and communicating. And I stopped listening.
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening. In this episode of Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, I have the opportunity to speak to Vanessa from Japan via New Zealand, via Rotary Scholarship, as a runner. So we had a lot in common where we both spend a lot of time fundraising for cancer research. And she raised money for her friend and committed to running every day of her life for 5 kilometres until her friend was cured from cancer. While listening to Vanessa at the beginning of the interview, she explained that she discovered that she also had breast cancer. So listen out in this interview what it feels like for a patient to hear a diagnosis when they've been diagnosed with breast cancer and what that means to them. More importantly, what they shut down and what they can't listen to when they're not available, when they're not able to listen to anybody else because they're completely listening to themselves. We couldn't go all the way to Japan and not ask the obvious question, how do the Japanese listen differently from Westerners? And Vanessa did a magic job of exploring high context Japanese culture and how Westerners are too quick to rush and not listen to the complete context, to listen to what's said, and more importantly, to listen to what's not said. Learn from Vanessa's own mistakes as she did her master's thesis in equality in Japan for females. Listen carefully how she talks about the role of judgement and filters and how that impedes great listening. Then finally, we have a quick look into the world of market research, a massive industry that helps organisations listen to their customers every day. And Vanessa makes a really potent point. She says customers are talking to you every day if you choose to listen. So let's listen to Vanessa.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
I would say the one thing I've learned about cancer is that it's not just a physical journey. It's a physical and it's an emotional and it's also a social journey. The patient isn't the only person who gets cancer. The whole family does. The friends do. The neighbourhood. The work colleagues. And I think physically, you're absolutely right. We've never been in a better place to be able to say physically you will survive this. The research is there. The more we know about cancer, the earlier we can get it and things like that. I think emotionally, it's a very different space. 10, 15 years ago, you would never talk about the fact that you had cancer. It was just something that was behind closed doors. It was the C word and all the rest of it. But I think there's a lot more stresses on people, for me personally, thinking about when I could and should go back to work, those kinds of things. And can you work full-time, part-time, and just the stresses of emotional body image, all these kinds of things that you're dealing with emotionally. For me, as a working mother who's a healthy marathon runner, it just started to crumble, the identity. And, a few weeks ago, my doctor said to me, she said, "You're holding on too tight to pre-cancer life." She says it's changed, and it's going to be different, and it's drawn a big black line in the middle of your life, which was before cancer and after cancer. And you have to get used to being on this side of the equation now. It's not any better or worse. It's just a different way of thinking about things now. And she did a perfect analogy for me, which I think is for me, I love talking in metaphors or analogies to help people understand when you're communicating with them. And she said, it's like people talking about before I had kids. And so before I had kids, I used to be able to do this. And I used to do that. And it's like, it's a pointless conversation because you can't go back to the before you had kids. You have kids now, and you're on this side of that line now. And I think that's the thing. I have to be careful about what I'm eating and drinking, and I haven't drunk alcohol for I don't know how long, and all the rest of it. And it's like I used to enjoy a really good glass of wine with my husband, but now it messes up all the medication that I'm with. And I just have to get used to it. And I think that's the big learning for me. It's not just a physical battle. It's actually an emotional and a social battle as well. And the power of community is just unbelievable. And for me, the running community, because I've been running for so long, and people coming together to run for cancer, to run with me on my first big race and all the rest of it, this is my community that's helping me through. And people will have lots of different ways of getting through it. But I think that's my big learning, at least from the last 6 months of my cancer journey, my first 6 months of my cancer journey.
What do you think the doctor was listening to that you weren't saying that they could explore that with you?
I'm really fortunate that with my doctor in particular, so she's on the board of directors for Run for the Cure in Japan, and so I've raised a lot of money for Run for the Cure before I got diagnosed, and she knew that I was running every day to raise money and raise awareness and for my friend. And I remember when I was first told, or when I was walked into the office ready to get my test results, and I did have my husband with me, and I was expecting it to be good news. Oh, it's just this kind of benign lump. The biopsies come back and it's all kind of... I'd convinced myself that it was going to be fine, so I hadn't actually prepared myself for anything other than, it's a benign lump. And bless her soul, my doctor, not the actual surgeon who ended up operating on me, but the doctor who needed to tell me my results, she just said, "So you've got cancer." That was the first words out of her mouth. And I just went blank. I couldn't. It was like the air conditioning became really loud and it was all just buzzing and I couldn't understand. And she'd gone into communication mode of, so the position where it is, this is what we need to do. You need to get your MRI. You need to do this so we can determine, the size, the spread, the blah, blah, blah. And she was systematically going through what she needed to communicate to me, ticking off the boxes and sort of saying, well, the earliest we can get you into surgery, given the process we have to go through, is 6 weeks from now. That would be this date. Are you free this date? And I was still back at, what do you mean I have cancer? But she had just moved on into, fixing stuff. And I was still at the, no, I don't have cancer. And my husband just grabbed my hand and he was taking all the notes. And he was texting my sons and communicating. And I stopped listening. And I think that's something that I've learned a lot, which is when you're giving tough news, whether it's a performance review, whether it's when you're presenting market research. My background is I'm in market research. But if you're presenting market research findings to a brand team that have worked for the last 8 months on a creative or a pack design or something which they have been working until 2 a.m. in the morning. It's their baby. And you're basically going to deliver to them, this isn't working. This is not what you need to be doing. That level of conversation has to be very thoughtful. And I think often the market research teams are very dry in the way that we communicate. We bring out our Excel spreadsheets and our numbers and our statistics or whatever. Or even if we're doing with qual, we bring out the verbatim response and we just chuck it up there as data because, comments and verbatims are data. And we're not actually being empathetic to the audience, to what their point of what they're coming in it from. And I think that's something I learned also too through the cancer journey was that, the doctor was charging through with her process of I need to communicate this, this, and this to you, just the way a market research report would be, I need to communicate this, this, and this to you, or a presentation. And you're not even stopping to see if your machine gun fire of insights, your machine gun fire of steps for your cancer treatment is actually landing at all. And that becomes really ineffective communication. So, and that in its sense means that we're talking, but we're not listening. And I think that that's something that, I've learned a lot and I've been very reflective on.
In hindsight, going back into the doctor's room, what could they have done to help prepare you for what you needed to hear?
So if you ask me what could they have done differently or better, the first thing the doctor could have asked me when I walked in for my results could have been, how have you been? It's been 10 days since the biopsy. How are you feeling? Just sort of checking where I'm at, my mind is at, because what she would have found if she'd asked me that question was that I had convinced myself that I didn't have cancer. And so from that point of view, I was coming from a very, I'm going to be okay mentality to dropping to, from coming from a plus to an absolute minus. Whereas if I had walked into that office with more of a neutral stance, I'm not sure if I have it or not, it would have been less of a drop. If I had sort of said, I think I probably have cancer, if she had gauged where I was at on that spectrum before she launched into her communication, it may have been better. On the flip side, when I actually had to go into the next steps with my surgeon and talk about the options, I'm fairly fortunate in that we found it relatively early, which meant that I had options. And, when you get it at later stages, your options start to run out. But I couldn't decide. I couldn't. She was putting the options, and there's this, and there's this, and there's the pros and the cons. I said to my surgeon, what would you do if you were me? And she said, I can't answer that because I don't know enough about your situation. So you're going to have to tell me about the things that are important to you. And once I know what's important to you or the values you have, then I'll be able to give you more information that will help you decide which is the right decision. So, for example, I don't take headache medication at all. I don't take medication. If I've got a headache, I figure I need to calm down, rest, go home early, whatever. I don't use pills to fix things which are wrong with me. And that helped her understand that the decisions we were going to make were going to be ones which was like, how can we avoid chemotherapy? How can we avoid putting pills and poisons into your body by making any kind of radical decisions and things like that? She started to understand my mindset. And I couldn't make a decision. I sat in her office and I cried, and she said to me, you know what, you and your husband need to go away and just have a really good sushi lunch and take some time. And if you need more time, you've got some more questions, come back and just let me know when you're ready to have another conversation, because I see this is really hard for you. So my surgeon was really understanding all of the signals that I was giving to her and responding very differently to the first sort of the test response lady. So I think gauging what's not said is really an important part, and I think that's what the doctors could have. I didn't walk into the office and go, into the doctor's office and go, I believe I don't have cancer. I'm not giving that up as my state of mind straight away. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, sounds like your surgeon was listening really well at level 5 and listening for meaning when trying to explore with you what was important to you. And it also sounded like you felt like you were heard as they took you through that process.
Yeah, you know what? She is one of she's Japanese, and she's just one of the better. I think there's one of the better listeners I've ever come across. Just a few weeks ago, when I went for my 6-month checkup, and she just basically said, the story I said to you before. She said, you're holding on too closely to what it was before. And I hadn't really said any of those things to her, but she was picking up little signals of sort of I wish I could run as fast as I could before I had cancer, and I wish, because I'm going to New York Marathon and I want to be able to run like I did New York Marathon 3 years ago. And it's these little things where she starts to identify the patterns, and then she sort of plays back to me. She goes, and it's interesting when you're trying to, in market research as well, when you're trying to show people that there's a pattern to something that's being said, it's good to replay the comment back to sort of say, well, you'd said this, or you mentioned that, and you mentioned this. I'm feeling that there's a pattern that's happening here of this. And it helps the listener actually see that, first of all, that they're being heard, because you're replaying some of their words back, but you're also connecting that meaning, but also finding context at times for the things that are being said. And that's quite empowering for the person who's talking. And so, if we go back to the doctor, where she's like, you've got cancer, and I'm like sitting there kind of, like a deer in the headlights going, what do you mean I have cancer? She's not even reacting to my reaction. And I think that's, it's like when you're playing tennis and you're just hitting the balls across across the court, and nobody's hitting them back to you to be able to have a proper rally. They're just whizzing and you keep firing. So I think that's the other thing is, everybody says communication is not just words, and they're so right. But how often are we actually really watching and listening to all the other pieces and the context and the nonverbal pieces? I don't think we do it enough.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
깊은 듣기.
Deep listening.
Vanessa, what do you think the Japanese can teach Westerners about listening?
The Japanese, there's a lot of things in Japanese which are just unsaid, and so it's not directly said. It's and you pick it up through the context, or you pick it up through the actions. The famous one that everybody seems to know about is like when Japanese people suck in the air when you say something, and you go, this means that you've really stepped over the mark. And so, but I think with Japan, the Japanese are I won't even just say listening and communication. Let's just step back. It's an incredibly considerate culture. People stand in line orderly. They, on the trains, they don't shout and yell at their voice or on their iPhones and things like that. So it's an incredibly aware culture of your surroundings. And I think that that's something that the Japanese culture, the Zen culture, the Buddhist backgrounds, the Shinto backgrounds, can actually teach us about an awareness of your surroundings, awareness of the details. That, I think, is something that Japan can teach, definitely, about how to listen, taking in all of the aspects and all of the details.
What do you think the big mistakes Westerners make when they go into Japan when they're not listening?
Taking everything at face value. There's a thing in that, as I just said, is in Japanese, there's so much more context and understanding. I'll give you a slightly funny story. The word for, in Japanese, you have words that don't always perfectly translate into English. But my husband is Japanese, so I came to Japan from New Zealand when I was 17 years old, and I was a Rotary International Exchange student. I had clearly written on my form that I wanted to go to Canada, but they sent me to Japan. And so, as any good 16, 17-year-old does, I stomp off crying to my bedroom saying, I'm not going to that country. And my mother basically said, yes, you will go, and if you don't like it, you can come back. Fate would have it that I met my husband in high school. So he was captain of the track and field team, and I was the exchange student. So we're the fairy tale, I keep reminding him. But when we decided to get married, and he announced it to his family were quite against it. And there was this element of him being the eldest son, and the eldest son in Japanese is a word, just as what it means, the eldest son. But behind it, there's so much context, and there's so much meaning to being the eldest son. And so, I phoned my mum and to tell her that I just accepted the proposal and we were going to get married, but there was a bit of a tension going on because my husband was the eldest son. And my mother kind of snapped back. She goes, what do you mean? You're my eldest daughter. And she got all indignant about it because she was just interpreting it in a way that you're my eldest daughter, you're important to me as well, and we're all happy for you. He's the eldest son. They should all be happy for him as well. But what she's not understanding is all the context that goes in behind that, and that's a cultural context. So often I would say that many Westerners come in to Japan and are just assessing it on what they see without actually taking the time to learn and maybe listen to the cultural context. So the idea that the eldest son has certain responsibilities to the family, and there was a concern about whether a foreign wife might be able to do that. Remember, this was 20-something years ago, so this is less prevalent now in Japan as international marriage becomes more usual. But 20-something years ago, it was very unusual. Especially this way around with the Japanese husband and the foreign wife. The flip with the foreign husband and the Japanese wife was a bit more common. So I think that's the mistake Westerners often make, is that they don't take the time to learn the context, the cultural, and to listen to the culture, and to not judge it. I wrote my master's thesis about the discrimination of women in Japan. And I came with my Western point of view that women were discriminated against in Japan. After I'd done all the research and the regression analysis and all the rest of it, I came to realize that I was defining equality in my own Western way, which was that if he can be a doctor, she can be a doctor. If he can be the president, she can be the president. If they're not, then we're not equal, and this is discrimination. Whereas Japan and many Asian countries define it slightly differently, which is that every person in society has an equally important role to play, and the role of quote-unquote men would be to put bread on the table or the economic side, and the role of women is to educate and raise the children, and these roles are equally important in society. Without them equally doing these things, society will not exist. And that is equality. Whereas I'd gone in with my own version of equality and trying to plaster it onto Japan. Now, whether it's right or wrong, I just don't put judgment on that at this point. But, that's what I learned, is that sometimes we just walk in with our judgments and our background, and we fail to see and we fail to listen because we have our biases. And being able to do it without biases, to actually say, I'm going to listen to you, or I'm going to see you with no predetermined judgments. It's a very, very hard thing to do because we always bring our own baggage to a conversation. But that makes the best learning experience, the best conversations, I think.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Penne ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
I think many people who run companies struggle with the constant chatter that we carry in our brains. and we don't allow ourselves the time to actually practice deep listening. What Oscar does is he eloquently outlines strategies to manage that struggle between feeling like we should be leading when we'd actually probably achieve more from listening. It's relevant, it's practical, insightful, and I think most of all, it makes you reconsider what listening actually is.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Penne ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
There's a vast amount of money invested by corporations into listening. How well do you think they listen?
First of all, you're right. There's a lot of money that's spent on listening, whether it's creating surveys and questionnaires or holding focus groups or many things. And I think the market research industry, is growing more and more because I think the idea of listening to the consumer, I think that recently we've seen the idea of, or a lot of companies talking about being consumer-centric, being consumer-led, which means that they need to listen to the consumer. I think that in my experience, there's certain, we'll use examples of like brand trackers and things like that we do. We're actually, in many occasions, asking the things that we want to track, the things that we want to know about, not necessarily the things that the consumer wants to tell us. We're also too often tracking so much data or too much data, and we're not actually using all of it. I often would not joke, but just comment on, the $100,000 doorstop, which is the idea that you've spent $100,000 on a huge piece of research for a 90 to 100 and 200-page document that people flick through once and then basically it sits on the floor. And it becomes the $100,000 doorstop. And I think that we need to get away from that. And the way that the market research industry is evolving, I think, is becoming better at understanding what the real question is and what the real need is and what we need to listen for. And also the idea that the consumers are actually putting that information for you out there every day, whether it's on social media or through your customer call center, or they're actually talking to you every day if you choose to listen. And I think that that's something that the market research industry is evolving to saying, you're not just going to speak to me when I want to hear you. You're not just going to speak to me when I do a focus group, or you're not just going to speak to me when I decide to run a survey. I'm actually going to listen to all the information that you're putting out there.
Thinking about the role of leadership and brands and how leaders set up systemic listening outposts, one of the more extraordinary leaders I worked with basically said, we just need to listen to every complaint and we will find out what we need to do. Let's not spend money on market research. Let's just listen and act on our complaints. I'm keen to hear your perspective on that.
So my perspective on that is that by listening to every complaint that comes into the call center is market research. I find it really interesting that people bucket market research to say it's the focus groups or the whatever. Market research, let's break it down. It's the market and you're researching it, taking the time to listen to the data that the consumer is providing to you. And so my perspective is, a lot of people always basically say, well, Apple doesn't do any research, or, these companies don't do research. But they do. They do ethnographic research where they just sit and they watch consumers. They watch consumers in conversations. They watch, I had a meeting today and I sort of arrived 20 minutes early, so I just sat in the cafeteria area that I was waiting. It was a hotel, cafe. And, this woman who was just really taking pictures of everything. And she was like in her 50s and she was taking Instagram or some kind of photographs of positioning her food perfectly and taking photographs of it. This is research. And so my perspective is that you do need research. And it's no longer the traditional idea. I think that's the message that I would send out to everybody is be a researcher. Everybody be a researcher. Have your notebook and go and talk to your consumers, or go and watch the supermarket aisles and just take some notes, or listen to a conversation, that's going on, and listen to what people are saying through your call centers or through your Facebook page, your Coca-Cola Facebook page or your whatever Facebook page, and the things that people are saying. Use that data. That is data, and that is market research. So I guess my point of view is, you don't have to spend money on creating data as much as you did before, because there's a lot of data that's coming straight at you. But do you still need to do analytics of that data? Yes. Do you still need to make sure you're putting into context? Yes. Do you need to take all of that complaints information and decide which is the golden nuggets and which is the stuff which is just, the guy that phones every Friday to complain about something? Yes, you need to clean it up. So there's still techniques you have to go through to make sure that you're listening to the right things, you're finding the signal, not the noise. But yeah, I think market research is being redefined, and it shouldn't just be, we're not going to do market research. It's like, no, we're not going to do market research the way we did it before. This is how we're going to research. And if people are uncomfortable with the word market research, then they should, throw it away and call it consumer listening or consumer interaction or whatever you want to call it. But the crux of it is what market research is, which is listening to your consumer, creating data around your consumers, and understanding your consumers. So, how you create that data and how you understand it is radically changing nowadays. But I still think it's as relevant as it ever was. And I think, the whole idea of big data is exactly that. There's so much data out there now. Now we need to understand how to use it and listen to it.
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening.
I think that the one thing that I spent a lot of time doing at Coca-Cola was teaching people how to listen and how to ask questions to make sure that you're a good listener. So, for example, a technique that I particularly like, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but that I believe in, is called stream of consciousness. And a stream of consciousness is just letting the person talk. So you basically draw 2 points on a piece of paper and say, this is where we were, this is where you were, point A, this is where you are now. Talk me through how you got from A to now. So, for example, this is where you were considering you needed to buy a new car, and this is where you actually bought the new car. Talk me through the process of how you got to the car that you decided to go to. And you just let them talk. And as they're talking, they will say things and sort of say, well, the carburetor was always causing me issues. And that's what made me decide I needed to buy a new car finally, because they'll talk you through it. And as they're talking you through it, they're remembering things that were important to them in this decision process. Oh, my mate said such and such a car was a really good thing, or the deal down there, whatever. And you write these down, and you write them down on a piece of paper. And then you've got this kind of, brain dump, if you like, from them. But then you go back to each one of these things, and you say, you said your mate down the road said whatever. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. Or you said you didn't want to buy a Honda. Tell me more about that. And it's interesting because we tend to, when we're interviewing, and researchers tend to ask why. And so you said you didn't want to buy a Honda. Why? You said that your mate did this and then, recommended that. Why? And why is a really, really, I'm going to even say bad, it's a bad question to ask of a consumer. It's a bad question to ask of your children. It's a bad question to ask because it makes people defend their point of view. If you basically sort of say, why on earth did you dye your hair blue? Versus, help me understand the new hairstyle. It's much more of an inviting, open conversation to say, I'm wanting to understand, as opposed to, I don't understand, you're going to have to explain yourself to me. And these are the kind of research techniques and questions that I think that we need to incorporate more. A lot of questionnaires are actually very forceful to say, I want you to pick one of these 5 things, as opposed to being more open to say, help me understand your point of view. And so the stream of consciousness approach, which is a qualitative approach with an in-depth interview, only takes 15, 20 minutes for people to go through it, but it's incredibly powerful. And I think it's underutilized, but as you go through, you'll start to find that the consumer themselves will start to recognize the patterns of thought or what's going on with them, and they become much more elaborative. We'd also do things in research where we would manipulate the context, and I know that sounds a bit, but for example, trying to ask somebody, so the example I'll give is we were trying to understand what the meaning of fruit juice for people was, like, just how important was fruit juice? And, it's breakfast and it's full of vitamin C and it's this and it's that and da. And that's about the level of insight that people would give us. So what we did was we took a group of people who were absolute fruit juice obsessed, right? They would always have their glass of OJ every morning. It's part of their ritual, blah, blah. And we got them to keep a diary for 10 days on, how they drank and all the different things through their day and what they were feeling and stuff like that. And then we banned them from drinking orange juice for the next 2 weeks, I think it was. And we took it away from them. And we got them to keep the diary as well, so that we could basically then see what they were replacing it with, what they were, how they were feeling, because they were having to write a diary and moods and things like that. And it became much more insightful. I've done this technique as well for a pizza company where we took pizza away from university students for like a month and said, you guys can't order pizza, like it was a group of them. And, what it became clear is that pizza is not just a good fast food that's relatively cheap. It's because it's round and it's communal. It's actually a really great thing that brings people together. The substitute would be like the fish and chips out of the newspaper, where everybody's reaching into the same place. Ordering separate hamburgers or separate boxes of KFC and things like that just doesn't work. And nobody ever said, oh yeah, pizza's a really communal thing. We're all like around the table and we're all like, they never give you that insight. So sometimes consumers can't communicate to you what they want to say.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
There were many things I took out of Vanessa's interview about the role of market research. The way she talked about the stream of consciousness interview and allowing people just to tell them a bit more about that. When she talked about a couple of the examples that she trained her staff to simply ask the question, tell me more about that, and what emerged that was so powerful and impactful in the research. Like Alan, in our second interview, Vanessa made a very strong point that why questions are loaded with judgment and they make people defend their point of view. So be very careful, be very, very selective when you use why questions, when you're trying to listen to others. Invite and explore and understand others' perspectives. Because when you do that, you can use powerful techniques. And remember the story about the pizza and the power of the pizza being round so that you can have a conversation, and the pizza represented community, not just food and carbohydrates. When you're listening as an organisation at that level, how your consumers are interacting with your product, but also with each other while they're using your product, that's listening on a much deeper level, and that can transform the way you move your brand forward. Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Lourdes Lassalle.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo Pohonu.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.